true power has never resided in the sword, but in making the sword unnecessary. The conqueror who needs to constantly wield steel is a failed conqueror, an amateur tyrant who confuses violence with mastery. The true masters of power understood something that transcends any military treaty: that voluntary submission is infinitely more effective than forced obedience, that a subject who kneels by their own choice is more valuable than 1,000 chained slaves. Submission was not the result of power, it was the weapon itself. The powerful of antiquity perfected the art of turning human will into their most lethal tool, of transforming the desire for freedom into a mechanism of self-slavery. They did not need armies for each village when they could make each village govern itself according to principles that guaranteed its perpetual subjugation. The true genius of domination is not in the ability to destroy resistance, but in the ability to make resistance never emerge, to create systems where the oppressed defend their oppression with more fervor than the oppressor himself. The pharaohs of ancient Egypt understood this alchemy of power with a clarity that still reverberates through millennia. They did not merely rule as kings, they ruled as incarnate gods. This deification was not vanity. It was surgical political technology. A king can be assassinated, a tyrant can be overthrown, but a god is eternal, unquestionable, part of the very cosmic order. When an Egyptian peasant handed over most of his harvest to the pharaoh, he did not experience this as theft, but as sacred tribute, as participation in maintaining Mayat, the universal order that kept the Nile flowing and the sun crossing the sky. The pharaoh had achieved something extraordinary. He had turned economic exploitation into a religious duty. The peasant who rebelled would not simply be challenging political authority. He would be transgressing cosmic laws, threatening the fundamental balance of the universe. Submission had been reprogrammed as the supreme virtue, as the noblest act a human being could perform. The power of the pharaoh did not lie in his guards, but in having kidnapped the entire apparatus of meaning of his civilization, in having made every act of submission simultaneously an act of devotion, of identity, of participation in something greater than oneself. This fusion of political power with cosmic significance required an elaborate machinery of consensus production. The Egyptian temples were not just places of worship, they were legitimization factories. The priests, a complete class supported by the state, dedicated their lives to interpreting divine signals that conveniently always supported the decisions of the pharaoh. A drought was not the result of weather patterns, but divine punishment for insufficient popular devotion. A military victory was not competent strategy, but favor from the gods toward their chosen son. The daily rituals in the temples, invisible to the common population but omnipresent in their collective consciousness, supposedly maintained the order of the cosmos. The implicit message was devastating in its effectiveness. Without the pharaoh and his priesthood, the world would collapse into chaos. Submission was not just prudent, it was the glue that held reality itself together. The common Egyptian lived in a universe where questioning the pharaoh was as absurd as questioning gravity. And that universe had been meticulously built, stone by stone, ritual by ritual, narrative by narrative, until the architecture of domination became indistinguishable from the architecture of reality. The Brahmin priests in ancient India perfected an even more sophisticated variation of this technology of domination. The caste system they developed was such an elegant social control mechanism that even today, millennia after its codification, it continues to operate in millions of minds. The perverse brilliance of the system lay in its simultaneous appeal to hope and fatalism. Your current position, they told you, is the result of karmas from previous lives. You were born untouchable because in past existences you accumulated spiritual debts. But, and here was the hope hook that made the system psychologically bearable, if you accept your position gracefully, if you fulfill your dharma without complaint, in your next life you will be reborn into a higher caste. The system turned present injustice into spiritual proof, into an opportunity for redemption. The untouchable who rebelled not only threatened social order, but also sabotaged their own future salvation. Submission was transformed into an investment in eternity, into the most rationally selfish action one could take. The Brahmins had achieved something that no purely coercive system of slavery could attain. They had made the victims vigilantly guard the boundaries of their own oppression, so that an untouchable punished another untouchable for violating caste restrictions, because such a violation threatened the karmic economy that was their only hope of eventual escape. This use of hope as an instrument of control was perhaps the cruelest of all mechanisms of domination, because it preserved in the oppressed just enough illusion of agency to prevent revolutionary despair. A hopeless slave is dangerous. They may decide they have nothing to lose. A carefully calibrated hopeful slave with a narrow path toward future improvement that requires present submission is perfectly controllable. They control themselves, discipline themselves, exploit themselves in the name of a future that will never arrive but must behave as if it could, because the alternative is to acknowledge that their present life has no escape or meaning. The Brahmins understood that the most effective power does not destroy hope. It cultivates it, channels it, transforming it from a potentially revolutionary force into an adhesive that keeps the oppressed attached to their condition. The Chinese emperors developed complementary arsenals of techniques of domination without explicit violence. The imperial examination system they institutionalized was simultaneously meritocracy and a mechanism of total control. Any man, in theory, could study the Confucian classics, take the exams, and ascend to positions of administrative power. This apparent openness of the system was its greatest strength as a tool of domination. It generated in each lower-class family the fantasy of social mobility, the illusion that their son could be the next to rise. Then, they impoverished the family by investing absurd resources in education. Decades of studying texts that taught no practical skills but ideological orthodoxy. 99% of the applicants failed, wasting their lives memorizing archaic texts and then accepting minor bureaucratic jobs grateful for the opportunity. The 1% who succeeded became the most fervent defenders of the system because their success validated the apparent meritocracy, and because they had invested so much in reaching their position that any criticism of the system was a criticism of the legitimacy of their own achievement. The emperor ruled an empire of millions without a massive army because he had turned ambition itself into a mechanism of pacification, had made each family invest its resources in a game that was statistically designed to produce losers, but psychologically designed to make those losers blame their own inadequacy rather than the system. This internalization of responsibility for structural conditions was the hallmark of all sophisticated systems of domination. Raw power says, "Obey because I force you." Refined power says, "Obey because if you don't obey, it's your fault that you suffer the consequences." The first generates resistance, the second generates cooperation. The Romans mastered this art. Their tiered citizenship system created infinite hierarchies of status, where each level had privileges over the lower level and aspirations toward the higher level. A freedman could look with contempt at a slave because at least he was free. A citizen without voting rights could despise the freedman because at least he was a native citizen. A citizen with limited rights aspired to full citizenship. A full citizen aspired to equestrian rank. An equestrian aspired to senatorial rank. Each level of the system had enough privilege to fear losing it, and enough aspiration to behave in ways that maximized the chances of advancement. The system turned each subject into a guardian of the hierarchies that oppressed him, because defending those hierarchies was defending his own relative position, his small portion of privilege over those below. Rome did not need armies in each province, because it had built a system where the oppressed oppressed each other, where each level extracted submission from the level below and handed it up to the level above, creating an unbroken chain of domination that flowed from the emperor to the last slave. Medieval guilds operated with similar principles, but on a more intimate scale. An apprentice would approach a master with a hunger for knowledge, mastery of a craft, access to a respectable profession. The master accepted the apprentice, but under terms that turned the following 7, 10, sometimes 15 years into barely disguised servitude. The apprentice worked for subsistence. enriched the master with their labor, and in return received carefully dosed fragments of knowledge. The real secrets of the craft were kept for the end, ensuring that the apprentice could not leave prematurely. And at the end of the period, when the apprentice expected to be elevated to master, they discovered that existing masters controlled who received that title and that their interests lay in keeping the number of masters low to avoid competition. Many remained officials for life, neither apprentices nor masters, in a limbo of semi-competence and semi-recognition. But they fiercely defended the system because they had invested so much in it, because the alternative was to admit that they had donated decades to a structure that had systematically exploited them. The guild extracted complete submission without the need for violence simply by controlling access to professional meaning, to occupational identity, making the craft inseparable from the dominating structure that surrounded it. The medieval Catholic Church perhaps perfected the most comprehensive system of domination without direct violence that the world had ever seen. Its power did not primarily reside in the Inquisition or the Crusades. Those were extreme measures for extreme cases. Its everyday power lay in having monopolized access to eternal salvation. According to official doctrine, every human being was born with original sin and was destined for eternal condemnation unless they participated in the sacraments administered exclusively by ordained priests. The Church had achieved something extraordinary. It had turned the entirety of human existence, life, and afterlife into institutional property. Being born without baptism meant eternal limbo. Dying without confession meant hell. Getting married without priestly blessing meant living in sin. The Church had inserted its representatives at every critical moment of human life and had declared those moments invalid without clerical participation. A peasant could hate the local priest, could recognize his corruption, hypocrisy, economic exploitation through tithes, and still bow before him because that corrupt priest was the only available intermediary between the peasant and God. The submission did not flow from love or respect, but from a terrifying calculation that the present discomfort of submitting to the Church was trivial compared to an eternity of torment. The Church had hijacked the afterlife and used it as a guarantee to extract submission in the present. This post-mortem meaning control required elaborate symbolic and ritual machinery. Gothic cathedrals were not merely places of worship. They were architectural manifestations of cosmology, hierarchy, and the infinitesimal position of the individual before the greatness of God and His Church. A peasant entering a cathedral immediately experienced his own insignificance, the impossibility of understanding the mysteries carved into each column, painted in each stained glass window, proclaimed in each Latin Mass he did not understand. This incomprehension was not accidental. It was intentional. If the peasant could understand the scriptures directly, if he could access God without intermediaries, the Church's power would evaporate. The Latin liturgy, the elaborate rituals, Byzantine theology, all served to create an impenetrable cloud of mystery that made sacerdotal mediation indispensable. The peasant learned that he was not only incapable of saving himself, but also incapable of understanding the terms of his own salvation. Total dependence had been manufactured and then declared a natural human condition, divine will, an order established by God Himself. The Venetian and Genoese merchants who dominated the Mediterranean developed equally sophisticated secular forms of control. Their power did not reside in war fleets, although they had them, but in having made entire cities economically dependent on them. They controlled trade routes, credit networks, access to distant markets. A city that rebelled against Venice did not face invasion. It faced embargo. Its products found no buyers. Its merchants did not obtain credit. Its economy withered until the local elites deposed the rebels and negotiated the restoration of relations. Venice had discovered that economic dependence was more effective than military occupation. An occupied territory requires permanent garrisons, breeds resentment that ferments into resistance. An economically dependent territory submits voluntarily. Its own elites become administrators of Venetian domination because their personal wealth depends on maintaining these relationships. Venetian merchants had turned the very network of economic exchange into their weapon of control. They had made commerce inseparable from submission, so that any community wishing to participate in the Mediterranean economy had to first bow before those who controlled its trade arteries. This transformation of necessity into an instrument of control reached its purest expression in the debt systems that permeated the ancient and medieval worlds. A lender who granted a loan with compound interest was sowing seeds of dependence that inevitably grew until consuming the debtor. The terms initially seemed reasonable, manageable, but were mathematically calibrated to ensure eventual default. The debtor would discover, after years of punctual payments, that they owed more than they had originally borrowed, that the interest had silently metastasized. Then the true extraction began. The lender did not want full repayment. They wanted a perpetual flow of partial payments. They wanted the debtor permanently in debt, permanently subordinate, unable to make major decisions without consulting the creditor. Debt turned economic relationships into power relationships, transforming seemingly voluntary transactions into mechanisms of long-term domination. The debtor had voluntarily entered into the contract, had signed the terms, and could not complain about injustice. His submission was legally binding. He had used his own contractual freedom to enslave himself, and that paradox was precisely what made the system so effective. Power that requires violence to sustain itself generates legitimate resistance. Power established through voluntary contracts creates guilt in the victim for their own situation. The explorers and conquistadors who initiated European expansion developed even more insidious methods of domination without open violence. When they arrived in new territories, they often did not start with conquest, but with trade, gifts, and alliances. They introduced metal tools to Stone Age societies, firearms to cultures fighting with spears, manufactured fabrics to communities that wove by hand. These gifts were not generosity. They were investments in future dependence. Once the native community became accustomed to metal tools, their own stone tool manufacturing techniques atrophied. Traditional knowledge ceased to be transmitted because it seemed obsolete. Within a generation, the community needed continuous trade with Europeans simply to maintain their recent standard of living. Then the terms of trade began to change, gradually becoming more unfavorable. But the native community could no longer effectively resist because it had lost self-sufficiency. It had been transformed into a dependent economy without firing a single shot. The conquistadors had learned that it was more efficient to make native cultures surrender voluntarily upon discovering that they could not exist without continuous participation in systems controlled by Europeans. This manufactured dependency strategy required patience, but generated a longer-lasting submission than any military conquest. The Jesuits in South America perfected this approach in their reductions. They gathered dispersed indigenous populations into centralized settlements, supposedly to protect them from slave traders, but actually to control them more effectively. They taught them European agriculture, manufacturing, music, all under Jesuit supervision. The indigenous people in the reductions lived better materially than many in traditional settlements, had access to tools, medicine, education. But they paid an invisible price: complete autonomy. Every aspect of their lives was regulated by the priests. Their religious traditions were replaced by Catholicism. Their social structures were dissolved and reconstructed according to European models. Their children were educated in Spanish and Latin, losing fluency in native languages. Within 2 generations, the reductions had produced populations that depended entirely on Jesuit infrastructure to survive, and had almost completely forgotten how their ancestors had lived independently. The Jesuits governed with near absolute authority, without the need for violence, because they had built systems where resistance meant hunger, cold, loss of everything that life in the reduction provided. Submission was simply the rational decision given the available alternatives, and those alternatives had been carefully eliminated under the guise of progress and protection. The British and French colonial systems that emerged later industrialized these techniques. Colonial administration did not need large permanent armies because it extensively employed native collaborators. They identified ambitious local elites, offered them European education, administrative positions, and access to wealth. These native elites, educated at Oxford or the Sorbonne, returned to their countries of origin psychologically colonized, convinced of European superiority, ashamed of their own traditions. They became administrators of colonial domination, cultural translators who made European power more palatable to native populations. They extracted resources, collected taxes, implemented policies dictated from London or Paris, but did so with native faces, in local languages, wrapped in rhetoric of modernization and progress. The genius of the system lay in how it turned conquest into a collaborative project, how it made native elites invest their identity in the success of the colonial project because their personal status depended on it. These collaborators defended colonialism more fiercely than the colonizers themselves because any criticism of the colonial system was implicitly a criticism of their own life choices, of their betrayal of their communities of origin. They had sold their loyalty for social position and now needed to believe that this sale had been ethically justifiable, that they were truly bringing progress and civilization rather than simply facilitating exploitation. This collaboration of native elites revealed something fundamental about how sophisticated power operated. It never tried to conquer the entire population. It only needed to capture enough members of the local ruling classes to create a self-sustaining structure of domination. The British in India governed 300 million people with fewer than 100,000 British administrators. The rest of the administrative apparatus was Indian, from police to judges, from tax collectors to military officers. These Indian administrators implemented British colonial policies on their own compatriots. The system worked because the British had created social mobility ladders that passed exclusively through collaboration with the colonial regime. A young, ambitious Indian who wanted education, social status, influence, discovered that the only available path was through service to the British Raj. He could reject that path on principle, but then he remained in poverty and insignificance while seeing his less scrupulous peers rise. Most chose collaboration, rationalizing it as pragmatism, as working within the system to eventually change it, as a necessity for survival. These rationalizations were exactly what the colonial system required to perpetuate itself. It didn't need everyone to believe in British superiority, only enough people to act as if they did, to make the choices that a true believer would make, because once those choices were made, once publicly committed to collaboration, cognitive dissonance turned pragmatic collaborators into ideological defenders of the system. Anthropologists and missionaries accompanying the colonial expansion played crucial roles in this process of domination without visible violence. They meticulously studied native cultures, identified their power structures, belief systems, and vulnerabilities. Then they advised colonial administrators on how to manipulate these cultures from within. If a native society deeply respected elders, the colonizers co-opted the elders. If a native religion had influential priests, the colonizers bought off or intimidated the priests. If a community valued certain rituals, the colonizers allowed those rituals but inserted elements that normalized colonial presence. Anthropological knowledge became a tool of control, an instruction manual for dismantling cultures without seeming to do so, to make native communities participate in their own subjugation, believing they were preserving their traditions. Missionaries complemented this work by attacking the native meaning apparatus. They declared traditional religions as demonic, ancestral rituals as sinful, native social structures as primitive. They offered Christian salvation as a replacement. But that salvation was packaged with European values, with submission to ecclesiastical authority allied with colonial authority, with acceptance of a world order where Europeans were at the top by divine design. The missionary who successfully converted a native community not only changed their religious beliefs, but also recoded their entire relationship with power, implanted new narratives about who deserved to obey and who deserved to command. The commercial corporations that emerged during this period, especially the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company, developed forms of power that transcended even traditional state control. They were private organizations with private armies, private fleets, private judicial systems, but operated with sovereign authority over vast territories. Their model of domination was purely economic on the surface, but totalitarian in effect. They arrived in a region, established trade monopolies through treaties with local rulers, and then gradually expanded control to govern directly. The transition from commercial partner to colonial ruler occurred so gradually that local populations barely perceived the change until it was too late to resist. These corporations had discovered that economic power, sufficiently concentrated, automatically transforms into political power, because whoever controls the economy of a region controls that region more effectively than any military conqueror, as economic dependence generates voluntary submission. A population that needs jobs, markets, credit, infrastructure, all provided by the corporation, is a population that dares not resist, because resistance means economic collapse. This corporate model of domination was perhaps the most insidious of all, because it was completely disguised as a voluntary relationship. No one was forced to work for the company. No one was forced to sell their products through the company's channels. No one was forced to take loans from the company. But the alternatives had been systematically eliminated. Competitors were bought or destroyed. Independent markets were dismantled. Alternative sources of credit were undermined. So when a farmer chose to sell their harvest to the company at prices dictated by the company, when an artisan chose to work in the company's factories under conditions set by the company, these choices were free only in the most technical and hollow sense. They were choices made within a context where all genuine alternatives had been eliminated, but where the facade of contractual freedom remained intact. The corporate power had perfected the art of enslaving through voluntary contracts, extracting total submission while maintaining the legal fiction that all parties were equal participants in free transactions. Colonial educational systems completed this cycle of domination by producing subjects perfectly adapted to their subjugation. A native child educated in a colonial school learned history from a European perspective, where their own civilization appeared as backward, primitive, in need of European tutelage. They learned European language as a language of serious knowledge, while their mother tongue was relegated to domestic conversation. They learned that success meant imitating Europeans, that progress meant abandoning native traditions, that modernity was synonymous with Europeanization. They graduated having internalized their own inferiority, having accepted that Europeans deserved to govern because they were more advanced, more rational, more civilized. This graduate would never lead resistance against colonial power. It is more likely they would become its administrator, a cultural translator, explaining to uneducated native masses why they should submit. Colonial education was the ultimate mechanism of control because it produced oppression that was reproduced across generations, transmitted from parents to children as if it were objective knowledge about the world rather than ideology specifically designed to perpetuate domination. Now then, each of these systems, each of these refined techniques of domination without explicit violence, operates under a common principle that transcends time or geography. All understand that the most enduring submission is that which the subject experiences as a personal choice, as a rational decision, even as an expression of their deepest values. The raw power that operates through threats of violence generates perpetual resistance that must be constantly suppressed through more violence. The refined power that operates through manipulation of context, through control of alternatives, through capture of the apparatus of meaning, generates submission that self-reproduces, which does not require constant supervision, because the subjects supervise themselves and each other. The question that these ancient techniques illuminate is not merely historical. The question is, how many of your own decisions, which you experience as free, as expressions of your autonomous will, are really choices made within contexts so carefully manipulated that genuine alternatives never appear on your horizon of possibilities? How many of the structures you defend, rationalize, normalize are instruments of your own subjugation that you have learned to call freedom? Because true freedom was carefully removed from the menu of options before you were asked to choose? At what point did your submission cease to be something imposed on you and transform into something you chose, defend, and now will impose on others because you have invested so much in rationalizing that submission that any questioning of it is a questioning of the complete coherence of your identity? Because true power, the power that endures generations, never conquers through swords. It conquers by making the act of raising swords seem irrational, unnecessary, unthinkable, until domination becomes so naturalized that it becomes invisible, and its victims simply call it reality.